If you've ever heard somebody say, we need to stop thinking about race and we need to think about class, this video is for you. If you've ever come across this and felt like there was something off about it, but you don't really know exactly how to articulate your problem with it, this is for you. After this, you will have multiple points that you can take to them, and whenever they argue that towards you, you can say, here, this is what you need to know. This is what you're missing. Or you can have the strength to do what's really necessary, which is to not give these people your air at all. I was planning on doing this talk before the Graham Plattner thing happened, the most recent thing, meaning the credible rape allegations that caused him to drop out of the race, essentially. Before this, I was still planning to talk about race and class. And I was planning to talk about this to illustrate, just as simple as I can, how much our ideas about class are just their own liberal identity politic, how they can't just be neatly categorized in terms of income. And we are going to talk about racialized labor, and I'll explain what that is in a bit. But this situation and ensuing discourse is a great platform for me to talk about exactly the problem that occurs when folks don't interrogate their colonial instincts, when folks refuse to see themselves as thinking colonially or thinking racist, thinking sexist, when folks refuse to say, even though I have left-wing opinions and I have I'm well-meaning, even though I'm that, I can still have these biases that hold me back. The Plattner thing is a perfect embodiment of exactly what you get when you try to play these stupid games. You win stupid prizes. Folks wanted a left-wing, gruff, white guy politician. They wanted the revolution, which is funny because electoral politics can never be a revolution, but they wanted change, right? And they wanted the change to come from somebody who looks like the enemy, because they wanted so badly to prove to the enemy, like, we can outflank you, we can outdo you. They simultaneously want to defeat the enemy and also to be given the enemy's legitimacy. They want to be legitimized by the people that they say they want to stop. This is a problem that's in our heads that we have to expunge right now. Right now. It's the same thing as like, you want to stand up to the bullies at school. Why? Because what you want is to be legitimized in the same system that has created these bullies. You don't want for really the change to occur. You have this traumatized response where it's like not good enough to simply be left alone, not good enough to have peace. You want the moment from the TV show or from the movie where you punch the bully in the face and the bully breaks his nose and he falls to the ground and he runs away screaming, "Oh no!" Or what you really want, because that won't be enough, is for the bully to, after having been punched in the nose, hold it on the ground and look up at you and say, "You know what? I underestimated you. You're stronger than I've ever been." And everybody applauds. You want these impossible things that have nothing to do with achieving the goals you actually need to achieve, that have nothing to do with actually liberating you, present or future, that have nothing to do with actually making things change. So that being said, this is not something that you can just neatly classify as political ideology problem, because whether it's some centrist on CNN saying the Democrats need to stop focusing on the woke and trans stuff and need to focus on dinner table issues like the economy, or whether it's a right-winger or a far-right politician talking about they've forced these liberal ideals down our throats, and meanwhile these capitalists are stealing everything from us and giving it all to the migrants and giving it all to the women, destroying our strong societies. Or whether it's somebody who's on the center left or a left liberal who's like, we need to vote in social democrats so that they can focus on economic issues instead of these liberal Democrats that only want to focus on identity politics. Or whether it's somebody who will call themselves a God's honest communist, but literally cannot understand why you keep talking about race at the literature club. All of these people are making a fundamental mistake based on the same thing. They're pretending that class is this objective, easily defined metric that has nothing to do with the social or the cultural at all. and that has nothing to do with ethnic and gender and sexuality difference. They want that because it's easier for them to stomach. Because if I'm a white guy and I'm straight and I'm not poor, and racism is a real material force and sexism is a real material force, then that means I have some complicity in that I need to address. That means that there are some things that I'm dealing with that can't overshadow what other people are dealing with. That means that other people's problems will sometimes have to take precedence over mine in the way that I see it in order for us all to get what we need. And what you see is that a lot of people don't want that. They want to live in a world where everything is a distraction except the one thing close to their heart. Everything is a distraction except that some workers don't make as much money as other workers, or they want to live in a world where we just change the means of production, and all that means is that regardless of race, we just don't do capitalism anymore. And that's not racial. But then that's going to fix the racism because it's going to end the distraction. They want to live in that world even though it's not how things work. And it takes a materialist analysis to combat this. Let's do some historical materialism. Starting with the Marxist definition of class. How do Marxists define class? Class is a group of people sharing common relations to labor and the means of production. In the process of production, human beings work not only upon nature, but also upon one another. They produce only by working together in a specified manner and reciprocally exchanging their activities. In order to produce, they enter into definite connections and relations with one another. And only within these social, that's funny that he says social. I thought social stuff didn't matter. Social connections and the relations does their influence upon nature operate, i.e. does production take place. These social relations between the producers and the conditions under which they exchange their activities and share in the total act of production will naturally vary according to the character of the means of production. What does that mean? Yeah, it is that problem, Chinyere. Let's just focus on winning. How do you win? So in a Marxist analysis, is your relation to the means of production. Sorry, I'm trying to make sure I say things clearly. So that means your social relations to the producers. It means your social relations to other workers. It means how you are stratified socially. So if it has to do with social things, and race is a social problem, and racism is a social problem, and patriarchy is a social structure, and anti-blackness is socially structured, and comp het is a social reality. Like, if these things are social, then that means they should have an effect on class, shouldn't they? And it's so funny that Marxist.com, that Marxist.org, literally addresses this in the next paragraph. The notion of class as it is used by Marxists differs radically from the notion of class as used in bourgeois social theory. According to modern capitalist thinking, class is an abstract universal defined by the common attributes of its members, like everybody who makes less than $20,000 a year and constituting a lower class. Categories and conceptions that have an existence prior to and independent of the people who make up the class. But for dialectical materialism, the notion of class includes the development of collective consciousness in a class. So this is very clearly telling you internet leftists, right? That no, class isn't some people who make more money versus some people who make less money. Class is something that has to do with how people relate to each other in society, how people interact with each other in society, how they categorize with each other, how they work with each other, how they work each other. And that just has to do with racism, doesn't it? As well as what kind of job you have, what kind of income you bring in, where you live, all of which can also directly relate to racism. It also could just not have to do with your income very much at all. Before I go forward, and we talk about some examples, I want to talk about why people say this and why it has gained so much traction. Why do people say, focus on class, not race? Focus on class, not gender. Why do people say when you talk about race and gender, you're doing liberal identity politics, you need to focus on class and class struggle? Well, it's because we have to acknowledge that the opposite is also true. That you can't talk about race without talking about class. That we can't understand racism if we're not talking about how Kamala Harris exploited prison labor from black prisoners in California, if we're not talking about the Palestinian Authority exploiting Palestinians, if we're not talking about all skin folk and kinfolk, then we're not really understanding racism at all. And in response to the capitalist optimism of the 2010s, where if we just diversify, if we just do DEI in the workplace, if we just elect politicians that look a certain way, that would be categorized a certain way racially, that's progress. And it proves that we're going in the right direction and we're addressing the problem, right? That has to be addressed. And I think people have addressed it pretty thoroughly by focusing on class struggle, beginning to embrace these ideas and anti-capitalism, and beginning to see the difference between what bourgeois Latinos want versus what poor Latinos want, and like also all the different categories of Latino there are, right? That there's not an intrinsic thing that makes me on the same side as you because you're also Asian and I'm Asian. Great. But like I said, what that means is not race is a distraction. Talking about racism is engaging with a distraction. Talking about gender is a distraction. It's unimportant. What that means is you can't talk about race without talking about class. You can't talk about gender without talking about class. And then vice versa. So now that we've gotten that out of the way, in order to illustrate today just how much you cannot separate class struggle and anti-capitalism from race or from other identity categories that you guys keep calling identity politics, we're going to talk about something called racialized labor. We'll get into some of the gender aspects of it too, but I want to focus more on gender in a separate video sometime down the line. I want to really hone in on race because there have been numerous stories in recent memory that you really get that racial angle of class analysis from. And it's good to go one at a time with these things too, so that folks don't get too like confused in many things, right? So what we're going to talk about today is a term called racialized labor. Have you guys heard this term before? Racialized labor. This fancy term, all it really means is a job or a gig or an occupation where you have to understand the racial component to understand the exploitation happening. And this is where we really got to get to lived experience a little bit, so to really understand what is meant by this, right? This is a term that many different Marxist scholars have used to understand, like, here's how racism works in capitalism. There are jobs that you see every day, and that every day you notice how much this particular job is oriented or seems to be occupied by a lot of people of a certain racial background. Every day you notice this. People talk about it, and yet the internet leftist doesn't really know how to approach it, because to the internet leftist, the only thing that matters is basically income and class position as an economic thing, and as a very economistic thing. So a lot of people are naming things in the chat. Let's name a few examples. Cleaning ladies. This is an article from the Economic Policy Institute. Domestic workers' pay and working conditions in the South of the US, the United States, reflect racist, gendered notions of care, rooted in racism and economic exploitation. See how the gender part always is important here too, okay? Because if we don't bring out the gendered part, a lot of you are gonna hear it's about class and race and think, oh, it's about black and brown men. But, perfect example, the typical domestic worker in the South of the United States earns just $18,252 USD per year. Lowest level of any region, and 61% less than the typical non-domestic worker in the US. Black and Hispanic women and immigrant workers are overrepresented in domestic work in the South. The concentration of women in color and immigrant women in domestic care work in the South and the continued low pay, poor working conditions, and exploitation they face reflects our cultural devaluation of care work, which is inextricable from the legacy of slavery and the evolution of the racist anti-worker Southern economic development model. So, first and foremost, $18,000 a year USD. Look this up. That is about the average income of a person in Bogota, Colombia, of a person in Rio de Janeiro, Brazil. It's just shy of the median income in a place like São Paulo, Brazil. So you're making basically Rio de Janeiro income in the United States, and you have to pay in USD for a place to live, for food, for transportation, for healthcare. It gives you a pretty solid indicator of like how much the global south is not a location. And this dynamic then has parallels that go even more extreme or even more noticeable when you go into the global south. When you go into the countries that are usually grouped in as a global south, you see, for instance, a 10-year-old black girl who was took from her own house in the interior of my state to work as a housekeeper in the capital. Very common in Brazil. So this is not only important to note because these are black men and women, these are brown men and women, but because their racial category is part of why they are exploited this way. Your job horizons are very much narrowed when you are a poor and black and brown person, in ways that are not as narrow if you are a poor white person, for instance. And then so much of this has to do with migration and the migrant laborer, who has very, very restricted options in terms of income, in terms of jobs, because of anything from lack of social acceptance, lack of social groups to work within, to the difficulty with documentation, making it so that you're essentially extorted into jobs that underpay, right? So this is one example. There's many examples, right? Asian laundromats, Chinese restaurants, Nerdy Glitter Patrol. Great shout. One thing I will distinguish when we talk about these things, like the Vietnamese nail salon, the Chinese restaurant, is that we're talking about ownership in these cases, as well as workers. And we don't want to necessarily talk about ownership in this conversation. Not that, small business owners who are working, not that small business owners can't be working class, can't be class oppressed or whatever, but we want to specifically talk about people who are laborers, not people who are small capitalists. Regardless, another great example of this is the restaurant worker. In every city that I've been to, especially in New York and Queens, your average restaurant worker is a Mexican person, a Mexican guy usually, and usually they're migrants, like not of Mexican origin, like Mexican migrants from Mexico, many of whom will be undocumented. Is this just a coincidence? Is it just a coincidence that they happen to have this racial category? They happen to be racialized a certain way, and the only thing we should focus on is the fact that they're making low wages? Or can we also see in their stories examples of this being the only line of work you can get into in a lot of places as a Mexican migrant laborer, because you can connect with other people who work there, who can get you in, because you can speak the same language doing it, because a lot of these jobs are low documentation, let's say, and essentially funnel in undocumented laborers in part so that they can underpay them. And then is it also because there is a dynamic within the average restaurant in which the Mexican worker is like seen as almost like a natural worker, that the Mexican worker is essentially easy to overlook. You don't have to worry about him because he's a machine. He got it, There was a case, I can't remember details, but from a few years ago, of a white restaurant owner who was showing off in this YouTube video segment in his kitchen, like how great this one Mexican worker he had in his kitchen is, how his role is essential in that kitchen, how he's been there for years and years, and how he doesn't need any rest, he doesn't need da 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 da. And people were like, yo, like, does that guy see his family? Like, are you paying him along these lines of like how important his work is? Because if his restaurant holds up your restaurant, if there's no restaurant without this guy, you can't replace him. You probably should be getting paid the most out of anybody there, right? So this is, again, racialization. And so the class, if you're gonna say like let's talk about specific classes, the class is not just working class, right? That's a useful term in some conversations, but if you narrow it, there's class differentiation between the Mexican migrant laborer, the Mexican migrant restaurant worker, the Haitian nanny, the Nigerian Uber driver, right? He's not in the same class position as a guy who makes the exact same wages, but he's a white 55-year-old US citizen Uber driver. They're not in the same class position. You can't just sort that by income. You can't just sort that by like what job does he have. You have to sort it by where is he living? What is his documented status? Are there social movements oriented towards hating this person? Because these are things of social relation. Don't worry, you have a solid job here. I take care of you. You'll have a job here as long as you want. And in a climate in which people want to get the Mexicans out of their city, I know that means a lot to you. So I know that you'll be understanding about your pay. If you think you can just explain that by saying the working class is exploited, then you're not a good Marxist. You're not a good leftist. You're not a good socialist. You're not a good XYZ. Prison labor. Okay, so you guys all agree that the police are racist, right? I know in my chat, everybody agrees that the police are racist, and it does not matter what city you live in. It does not matter what country you live in. If you're from Brazil, you absolutely know that the police are racist. If you're from Indonesia, if you're from the United States, if you're from Canada, police are racist, right? And if you're some sort of leftist, some sort of anti-capitalist, you might agree also that the police exist to protect property. They protect rich people, they protect property, they protect money. That is their job. So then if the police's job is to protect capital and to protect capitalism, and also the police are always racist, is that some sort of coincidence? Do you mean to tell me that's some sort of coincidence? You mean to tell me that in order to understand capitalism, you can't talk about race, or we shouldn't think about race because it's a distraction, but also the very force that exists in the modern city to protect capitalism is objectively racist in ways that everybody knows and in ways that are materially calculable, and those things they just exist together. No deal, no big deal, no need to look into it too much. That's what you mean to tell me? Like, genuinely, like, that's what you mean to tell me? Like, okay, I don't believe you, but if that's what you want to say. Here's another example of why you can't understand class without understanding race. Here's an example of how racialized labor happens. Here's a video I came across on my algorithm today. ICE took my loved one away. You can help.
Hi there, I'm Evie, and I'm opening emergency art commissions to help my loved one who was yesterday captured by ICE while he was on his way to work. We have been given a chance to free my loved one, so I'm using my art to contribute as much as I can while I get a job. My Ko-fi and PayPal will be below. I can draw cats, dogs, furries, critters. I offer headshots, full bodies, bookmarks, and more.
This is how it happens. You don't think of the idea of somebody being an online artist who takes commissions. You don't think of that person and that job as being a racialized job. But let's say you are from Latin America. Your family migrates to the United States. You go to school, and then you are not particularly able to socialize well at school because you have specific interests and you don't fit in very well. You're still learning English. And then over time, you find yourself online a lot and you find yourself being really interested in art. Then as things happen, as racism has these material consequences in which Mexican people or anybody brown are targeted by an armed force by the federal government to be kidnapped, put in cages and deported, or worse, somehow worse. You have this skill and you want to be this artist. And that's where you've kind of been pushed to by this situation. So what do? I'm going to make art online and take commissions. And that will help pay for this. That will help pay to help get my loved one free from ICE. This is how it happens. This is like the origin point of how racialized labor emerges. You can picture it the same way with the first Mexican restaurant worker in New York City. What am I gonna do? I can cook. And I see other Mexican people do it. You know, the next guy comes, he's like, there's another Mexican guy who works in a restaurant, we'll cook there. And then other Mexican people come and open up restaurants, and then more Mexican people work in restaurants. And then more people come in and they're like, well, I'm trying to get a job in the United States. I don't really know what I'll do, but there's a bunch of Mexican people who cook in restaurants here, so I'll learn how to do that. That's how it works. If you don't talk about the racial element, you're not talking about the exploitation. Here's another example. As a matter of fact, here's several examples. This is a video that my executive producer sent to me. And I want you, as you watch this, to think about the classes that exist in each of these cases that led to this, that lead to these examples of these examples of this phenomenon.
I posted a video yesterday about 17 black people who died mysteriously and quickly realized that this list is never ending. If you're white, please watch all the way through. We are not allowed to look away when we feel uncomfortable anymore. On June 29th, just last week, Gerard Jackson went to a music festival with his white friends before one of them contacted his mom and said he was missing and having a mental health crisis. His family says he's never struggled with that before. His friends say they took his phone and keys away and he must have taken his keys back while they were sleeping, even though he didn't take his phone, he was found hanging in a wooden area with his car over a mile from the festival grounds. During the period that he didn't have his phone, there were several attempts to log into his bank account, and his Apple Pay was used at a local gas station. His family says there's no way he killed himself, and on top of all of this, they cremated his body without their permission. Ternia Nicole Miller was found hanging in a tree in Miami just 3 weeks ago on June 18th. She was there to celebrate Juneteenth, and her death was ruled a suicide. Why the fuck would she post on Instagram that she was traveling for Juneteenth and then proceed to? In November of 2024, 15-year-old Jalen Reeves was stabbed to death 6 times by a 14-year-old white boy. That boy was later cleared of his second-degree murder charges, claiming self-defense. And guess what? His dad is a high-level executive at Axon. What's Axon, you might ask? An American company primarily developing weapons and technology for military and law enforcement, known for its taser electroshock weapons, a market it has dominated since 2003. He works for a police weapons manufacturer. In 2021, Jelani Day went missing and his remains were found weeks later in an Illinois river. Police ruled it an accidental drowning, and his mom calls that an insult. She said Jelani was an avid swimmer, and avid swimmers don't drown themselves. He has never had depression or struggled with mental health. In 2020, 15-year-old Kawan Charles was picked up by his white friend and his friend's mom, who allegedly gave them alcohol, weed, and mushrooms, and didn't report him missing for 4 days after he said he was going to kill himself and left their house. He was found lying face down in a sugarcane field with only a few inches of water, and the official report says he likely drowned himself on purpose. How he could have drowned himself in 6 inches of water is beyond me. Willie Jones Jr. was found hanging in his white girlfriend's parents' Mississippi yard in 2018. Her stepfather says he didn't touch him, but Willie's family says he had an athletic injury that limited his shoulder mobility to the point that he physically couldn't have hung himself. Of course, it was ruled a suicide. The family did win a wrongful death lawsuit 3 years later, but to this day, no arrests have been made.
I'm going to pause this video here just because there's a particular case that you have probably heard about that illustrates this point even more, and that afterward we have like a very clear, again, class dynamic kind of revealed to us. Okay. I also want to just thank you all for your patience. I know that that's a very hard video to listen to, but the case of Nolan Wells is one that I'm going to try to pull up the right video to describe. The case of Nolan Wells is one that people are kind of connecting with all of these different, what seem to be murder, covered up by police and covered up by white friends in proximity to the fallen black person. And because of it, I want to bring, after I show you what the case is, I want to point to some things about this that again will make you question these very bizarre internet leftist narratives about class. Okay.
Morning, we're focusing on the desperate search for answers in the mysterious death of 18-year-old Nolan Xavier Wells. He didn't return with friends after a 4th of July boat trip to a Mississippi island. Wells' mother reported him missing that very night, but tragically, a few days later, his body was found. Now, there are a lot of questions about what happened to him, and his family is demanding answers. Nolan's parents, Christine and Elmore Wansley, and their attorney, Ben Crump, are joining us now in studio to talk more about this. Thank you both, and Attorney Crump, for being here under these especially difficult circumstances that no parent ever wants to live through. Christine and Elmore, can you help us understand what your understanding is of the timeline and what questions you both still have about what actually happened to Nolan?
So he basically, the night before, all the boys got together, stayed the night. 4th of July, they launched the boat. They went to the island, and that was that. I was expecting hey, we're back, like he normally does. Didn't happen. Get a phone call around 11, 4th of July. Hey, have you talked to Nolan? And I'm like, no, where is he at? So then my friend Tashima was so helpful in tracking his phone down because everyone was looking at the Snapchat location because all the kids follow each other. But I was looking at Life 360 and I'm like, well, I don't understand because I'm literally looking at his phone like it's at someone's house. So thankfully my friend did go grab the phone for us as we were kind of doing the other part of it, which was notifying, the local authorities, trying to figure out who we needed to speak to do the missing persons report, because I know that needs to be done as soon as possible, especially when we're talking about water. We wanted to make sure that we could try to find him, and that was the goal.
Who called you?
So this Nolan Wells case is like the latest in what has seemingly been dozens over the past few years, at least, of mysterious disappearances and mysterious deaths, hastily labeled suicides or accidental deaths by police. And it's a subject that keeps coming up on social media to a point where it reminds you of how class really works. Because what I think is fascinating about this case is that these folks, this family, are ostensibly a middle class or upper middle class family. They should be in the same class position. If you only think about class in terms of income and economism, they should be in the same class as any middle class white family here, right? And yet, right, I want to talk too about, for instance, the high school that Nolan Wells went to. It's called Ocean Springs High School. This is, I believe, where he met these friends, where he played football. This is a high school that is ranked second in Mississippi. It is a highly rated educational institution. In this school, okay, the demographics are 70.8% white, 12.9% black, 6.3% two or more races. Okay. The graduation rate is somewhat above state median, right? This is supposed to be the school you send your kids to when you make it out of the oppressive system. This is supposed to be that, middle America, heartland high school that if you're in some, part of the global south in like a far off country, you look at and you're like, these damned Americans, right? Like, this is that kind of school. This is supposed to be that kind of school. And yet certain things are still possible for certain groups of people, even when they meet all the criteria that supposedly would make you on the other side. I found a Reddit thread about Ocean Springs High School. Somebody was asking in the Biloxi subreddit, I'm considering a move for myself and my kid to Ocean Springs. My concern is that my child is trans. In our town now, we have a great LGBTQ plus community. I'm scared to lose that. Ocean Springs seems right up our alley. We love art, music, and food. And you have comments basically saying, hey, I'm a 48-year resident of the coast here. I hope you don't mind your kid being bullied relentlessly. Read Ocean Springs' talk of the town on Facebook. Some people say that it's a phenomenal school district. So this is a different axis of class oppression because you have institutions like the police that are meant to secure capital that cover up potential racist killings that essentially facilitate racialized death, even for black people of supposedly higher class status. Meaning, even when you're in the same class as them, you're not quite in the same class as them. And that's why it's really important that you get your knowledge of oppression and class struggle from the real world and not just from internet debates. Because if you go on social, you can sometimes see people dismiss this idea that like Black Americans are still oppressed or are still as oppressed as insert poor person in the global south, that are still very interested in like class being a tier list, which can be measured clearly through income level. But class is a social phenomenon. That is the Marxist reading. It is a social relation between consumers and producers. It is not about whether or not you fit the image of class mobility. It is not about whether or not you make a certain amount of income. Even when those things skew more in your direction as you climb up a certain ladder, race will still classify you otherwise. Race will still be a mechanism through which, as long as you don't own important things, race will still be a mechanism through which your death is facilitated or covered up by capitalism to keep the profit margins turning, to keep things as they are. Because the police exist not just so that poor people, don't go certain places or don't shop at certain institutions. Not just so that rich people don't face any consequences and are kept safe from the masses. The police exist to do racism, to do sexism, to specifically beat down certain populations, regardless of their income in many cases, so long as it doesn't interfere with who owns what. Even if you come from a nice background, you're still a worker. And if you're a black kid in training to be a worker, i.e. you're in high school, there's nothing you can do in front of the police. The police can still bury you, and they will bury you. Because if they did otherwise, they would be doing a bad job of maintaining the order of economic everyday practice. Like, if the police actually put forward to you how much racist violence was happening, actually acted as a group to fight against racism, you would see a lot more striking. You would see a lot less business as usual. You would see a lot more capital dissipate because of their exploitative relations being undermined. So there is no talking about class without talking about race. And in a world in which this is still happening and there's no foreseeable end to it, and the people that are either doing it or complicit in doing it are the property owners and the capital owners and their violent guards, it's clear that there is no anti-capitalism without an anti-racism. This colorblind class struggle shit, it doesn't work. It's undermined several different attempts to organize throughout the 20th century. All these different colorblind leftists repeat the same mistakes over and over again because to them, they're not mistakes. To them, if white people get a pay raise and black people continue to be systemically targeted, systemically facing violence in the workplace, even when they have the same job, systemically denied resources or paid less, even at the same job, that doesn't matter to the white leftists because what they really cared about was their own security. And that's what the class struggle meant to them. And that's what the class struggle means to a lot of these people. It doesn't matter if you tell them exactly how capitalism works. What they want to hear is how to make themselves feel better and do better in the system as currently intended. And if there's an issue of lack of class consciousness, as some dumb beats says, it's because we keep trying to separate the conversation of class and race, because you can't understand class at all if you don't understand race.